A quiet afternoon, a sidewalk, children passing by in the routine rhythm of a small Canadian town. Nothing about the scene suggested that investigators would later watch it hundreds of times, searching for the exact moment everything changed. Then she appeared. 8-year-old Victoria Stafford walked calmly along the street in Woodstock, Ontario, her backpack resting lightly against her shoulders. School had just ended. It was supposed to be a short, familiar walk home. But within seconds, another figure entered the frame. A woman stepped beside Victoria. The two walked together, turning a corner and disappearing from view. That was the moment investigators would later call the turning point, the final confirmed sighting before the case became one of Canada's most haunting child abduction investigations. It began quietly, when Victoria failed to arrive home that afternoon in April 2009. Concern quickly turned into alarm. Her family contacted authorities, and within hours, local police began searching the surrounding streets. But nothing made sense. There were no signs of struggle. No witnesses reported hearing anything unusual. The route was familiar, safe, and frequently used by students. Then the search expanded. Officers canvassed neighborhoods, volunteers gathered. Posters began appearing on storefront windows. News outlets picked up the story, transforming a local concern into a national search effort. The case escalated rapidly. Soon, the Ontario Provincial Police joined the investigation, bringing additional resources and specialized units trained in missing person cases. Investigators knew that the first 48 hours were critical, and they were running out of time. Detectives began retracing Victoria's route step by step. They knocked on doors, reviewed traffic patterns, checked school records, interviewed classmates. Every detail mattered. But the biggest breakthrough came from something many people overlook: surveillance footage. A nearby business had a camera pointed toward part of Victoria's walking route. Officers requested the recording. When they first watched it, nothing seemed unusual. Then they noticed the woman. She wasn't interacting aggressively. There was no visible force. Instead, she appeared calm, almost casual, as she walked beside Victoria. That detail unsettled investigators. It suggested planning, and possibly familiarity. The footage was enhanced and released to the public. Within hours, tips began flooding in. One tip stood out. A witness recognized the woman. Her name was Terri-Lynne McClintic. As detectives began building a timeline around McClintic, another name surfaced: Michael Rafferty. The connection between the two raised immediate concern. Investigators soon learned that Rafferty and McClintic had been associating closely in the days before Victoria disappeared. Interviews revealed unusual behavior patterns and inconsistencies in their accounts. The case shifted. What had begun as a missing person search was now becoming something far more serious. Detectives moved quickly. Both individuals were brought in for questioning. At first, the interviews produced little. Answers were vague. Timelines conflicted. Details didn't align. But experienced investigators noticed something else: pressure was building, and cracks were beginning to form. Meanwhile, the search for Victoria intensified. Hundreds of volunteers covered fields, wooded areas, and roadside routes. Helicopters scanned large stretches of land. Emotional support centers were established for the community. Across Canada, people followed every development. Parents watched closely. Because the case touched a universal fear, the moment a routine day turns into something unimaginable. Then investigators discovered the first unusual clue. During questioning, statements provided by McClintic began shifting. Small details changed. Locations didn't match earlier answers. And one comment, barely noticeable at first, hinted that Victoria may not have been taken randomly. The possibility of premeditation emerged. Detectives pressed harder. Hours passed. The room grew quiet. Then came the moment investigators later described as the turning point. McClintic asked to speak again. This time, the tone was different. And what she said next would change the entire direction of the investigation. The case was no longer about finding a missing child. It was about uncovering a crime, and where it had led. But the most difficult discovery was still ahead. By the time investigators reopened the interview room, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as cautious questioning was now a race against time. Detectives needed answers, and they needed them fast. Terri-Lynne McClintic's statements were becoming more detailed but also more alarming. Investigators noticed she was no longer speaking in general terms. Instead, she began referencing locations, specific locations. That was the moment officers realized the investigation had entered a critical stage. Search teams were redirected. Rural areas surrounding Woodstock were mapped and divided into grids. Officers and forensic teams began methodically working through each section. Every movement was careful, every step documented, because at this stage, evidence mattered more than ever. Meanwhile, investigators shifted focus toward Michael Rafferty. Unlike earlier interviews, this time detectives approached the questioning with newly developed timelines and digital evidence, phone records, location data, witness accounts. Each piece added pressure. Rafferty's responses became increasingly inconsistent. Investigators noticed subtle changes in his tone whenever certain time periods were mentioned, particularly the hours following Victoria's disappearance. Then came another key development: vehicle information. Detectives had identified a vehicle connected to Rafferty that may have been used on the day Victoria vanished. Forensic teams began examining it carefully. Inside, they searched for trace evidence, anything that could confirm movement patterns or interactions. The process was slow, but the results began forming a clearer picture. At the same time, the emotional weight of the investigation continued growing. Community members held vigils. Schools provided counseling support for students. Across Canada, the case had become deeply personal. The image of Victoria smiling, young, and full of life appeared everywhere. Investigators felt that pressure. Because every hour mattered, then the breakthrough came. During coordinated searches based on updated interview information, officers discovered evidence confirming what investigators had feared. The case had shifted fully from a disappearance to a homicide investigation. Authorities moved carefully with public communication, releasing information responsibly while continuing to build the case. Behind the scenes, forensic analysis intensified. Digital timelines were reconstructed, interview transcripts were reviewed repeatedly, and prosecutors began preparing for what would become a complex courtroom process. But there was still one major question: intent. Detectives needed to understand not only what happened but why. Motive would play a crucial role in court, and that answer would come from an unexpected place. Further interviews revealed behavioral patterns between Rafferty and McClintic that investigators described as deeply concerning. Statements suggested planning elements and decision-making moments that would later become central during trial proceedings. Each new detail increased the emotional stakes, not only for investigators but for the entire country watching. As the evidence strengthened, charges were formally prepared. The courtroom phase was approaching. But even experienced investigators knew something important. Courtrooms don't just test evidence. They test truth, and in this case, that truth would soon unfold under intense public scrutiny, because what would emerge during the trial would reveal a deeper, more unsettling timeline than anyone expected. In the quiet town of Woodstock, Ontario, a bright-eyed 8-year-old girl named Victoria Stafford, known to her loved ones as Terri, vanished while walking home from school on April 8, 2009. The search that followed captured the nation's heart, a desperate plea for her safe return echoing across the country. But hope turned to horror just over 3 months later, when her remains were discovered in a remote field, miles from her home. The investigation soon zeroed in on two individuals, Terri-Lynne McClintic and her boyfriend, Michael Rafferty. What unfolded next was a legal saga that would reveal the chilling details of Tori's final hours and the dark motivations behind one of Canada's most heartbreaking crimes. The first major breakthrough came when Terri-Lynne McClintic was arrested. Initially, she pointed the finger squarely at Michael Rafferty, claiming she was an unwilling participant, coerced by a controlling and violent partner. She agreed to a plea deal, pleading guilty to first-degree murder in 2010, which came with a life sentence. The expectation was that she would be the prosecution's star witness in the trial against Rafferty, painting him as the sole architect of this monstrous act. This seemed to be the key to securing his conviction and delivering justice for Terri. The stage was set for a courtroom battle where McClintic's testimony would be the central pillar of the Crown's case. However, when Michael Rafferty's trial began in 2012, the narrative took a shocking and dramatic turn. As Terri-Lynne McClintic took the stand, the story she told was vastly different from her initial statements to police. In a stunning reversal, she testified that it was she, not Rafferty, who had delivered the fatal blows to Terri. She claimed that while Rafferty was responsible for the abduction and was present during the crime, she was the one who ultimately took the young girl's life. This bombshell testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom and across the country. It completely upended the prosecution's strategy and created a whirlwind of confusion and public outrage. Why would someone who had already pleaded guilty to murder suddenly confess to being the primary aggressor? The defense team for Michael Rafferty seized on this new confession. They argued that McClintic was a liar, a manipulative individual who was changing her story to protect herself or for reasons unknown. They portrayed Rafferty as a dupe, someone who was drawn into McClintic's dark world but was not the mastermind or the killer. The prosecution, on the other hand, had to scramble to salvage their case. They argued that regardless of who delivered the final blow, Rafferty was just as guilty. Under Canadian law, if a murder occurs during the commission of another serious crime like kidnapping and forcible confinement, all participants can be found guilty of murder. They painted a picture of Rafferty as a predator who orchestrated the entire event, from the abduction to the horrific final moments. The trial was a grueling, emotionally charged ordeal. Jurors were presented with disturbing evidence, including security footage of Terri being led away by McClintic, and heard heart-wrenching testimony from Terri's family. The key question was not whether Rafferty was involved. His participation in the abduction was clear, but the extent of his culpability in the murder itself. Did McClintic's shocking confession absolve him of the murder charge? After weeks of testimony and intense deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Michael Rafferty guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. The verdict affirmed the prosecution's argument that his role in the kidnapping and the events that followed made him equally responsible for Terri's death, regardless of whose hand struck the final blow. Both he and McClintic were sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, a small measure of justice for a crime that left a permanent scar on a family and a nation. Thank you for watching, and please consider subscribing for more deep dives into complex cases.